So that we're here coming into the last full panel of the conference. Thank you all for joining us for this. The question we have is money, climate and political will, where next? And we've got just a brilliant panel for this, drawing on both climate and tax expertise, which in a sense is what we've tried to do through this whole conference. We're kind of clear that we need and want to tackle the climate crisis and to tackle inequality. The question we have really is whether and how those goals can be compatible, given not least the very powerful forces that oppose progress on both aspects. So we have a combination of thinkers and politicians. That's unfair to the thinkers who are political actors and the politicians who are also thinkers. But we've gone for a kind of balance, and very happy to have such a strong panel. I will introduce them in a moment, and then they'll each present for perhaps 5 or 7 minutes, talking about particular aspects of this, and then we'll open up into a Q&A. And I hope in that Q&A we can really work through some of the hard detail, because you've heard yesterday and today, and we can see it in the Q&A and the chat discussions, just how difficult these issues are. Every time we think there's an easy answer, there isn't. And by bringing together the different concerns, we have a chance to to really move some of the thinking along. So let's try and do that in this session. I remind you of the hashtag, which I think is climate justice. Someone will correct me, I'm sure, if I'm wrong. Please do also tweet. And just a reminder that the questions for the panelists should go in the Q&A rather than the chat, so they're easier for me to pick up. Okay, the panel, we have a very nicely balanced panel. If by balance you think this should be the same number of people who have been members of the European Parliament for the Green Party and people at the University of Warwick. So on the Green Party side, we have, first of all, Molly Scott Cato. Molly was a Green Party MEP from the UK between 2014 and 2020. And in the Parliament has been an important voice for tax justice, and also as at least one Brexit Party MEP now knows to his shame. Molly is also, of course, a professor of economics, currently professor of green economics at the University of Roehampton. If you haven't seen that clip on YouTube or somewhere, do go and look for it. It's very good. Our second MEP is Sven Giegold, who's a Green Party MEP from Germany. And Sven's been a long-standing, one of the longest-standing advocates of tax justice. Was actually one of the founding members of our board, and incidentally has just published a 7-point agenda to strengthen global tax transparency, which I recommend very, very highly to you. Then we have Harpreet Kaur, who is a human rights lawyer and PhD candidate at the University of Warwick in the law school. And her research focuses on climate justice. Now, Harpreet has worked with various NGOs, including Amnesty International and People and Planet, and has a set of upcoming publications actually addressing variously climate reparations, kind of global perspectives on the idea of a Green New Deal, and just responses to climate migration. It's really perfectly positioned to speak on these issues. And last but not least, we have Leon Sealey-Huggins, who is an assistant professor at the University of Warwick in the Global Sustainable Development Programme, which is part of the Department of Sociology, and was formerly at the University of Leeds. And Leon's focused really on the sociology and the politics of the climate crisis, particularly in the Caribbean, looking at ideas of what climate justice actually means in the context of the enormous inequalities, many of which stem from the global legacies of empire, of course. So between these panelists, we have the potential to really cover off the whole set of issues between economic justice and climate justice, thinking about the experience in countries at different income levels and countries with different experiences of economic and imperial politics over the last many centuries. So let me not talk any more, but rather introduce the first of them. Just to split it a little bit, Molly and Sven will talk about how successful or otherwise the European Green Deal is as an idea, and what the best ways might be to push Europe forward towards tackling climate change, and how Europe can take a lead in the global discussions. So let me ask Molly, if I can, to take the floor first, and then we'll go to Sven, and then I'll put the questions for Harpreet and Leon.
Thank you very much, Alex. Hi, Sven, and it's very nice to see everybody here. I heard Sven's presentation earlier, and so I won't speak that much about the European Green Deal because he knows a lot more about it than I do, and he's already covered a lot of that turf. And I'd also say, just on opening, if you're looking for an international global network that pulls together all these issues, you might think about investigating the global Greens. That is the end of my political statements, but it's certainly worth thinking about. So I've got time to say 4 things very quickly. The first one is that what COVID is doing is really changing the value of different types of assets and also making people rethink what they value. And the Reith Lectures, the BBC's sort of preeminent lecture series, this year is being done by Mark Carney, who I agree with what Daniela said about him earlier, but nonetheless, he has taken that as his theme, which I think is very interesting. Because what we're seeing through this COVID crisis, it's really revealing the huge inequalities in our society. And a lot of people are genuinely being pushed into destitution, while at the same time, some of the world's wealthiest people are growing richer, and the number of billionaires is increasing, and the billionaires are individually accruing vast amounts of cash. So I agree with what Sven said earlier. This is an enormous opportunity. There's a real radicalization going on out there, a building up of the sense of communitarianism and a sense of injustice around how money is allocated in our world. So I think we mustn't waste that opportunity to push forward some of these policies that we've been arguing for around tax justice and social justice more widely. And also, just as a quick aside to that, we're seeing the collapse in value and sort of artificial values, but nonetheless, our economies are shrinking. And what we have to do is make sure that the bits that are lost are the bits that cannot contribute to a net zero carbon future, and that the value and wealth that's lost is the wealth of the richest people. So we can come out of this as a smaller global economy, but a sustainable global economy, and one where there's less inequality. That's my first point. The second point is just to support what was said yesterday about the carbon tax and dividend proposal. Now, obviously, a lot of this is about what rate you set the carbon tax at, but we responded to Boris Johnson with our own 10-point climate plan yesterday, and we said £100 per tonne for rising to £500 per tonne by 2030. This is obviously a very high rate of carbon tax. And I said to somebody, basically it means by 2030, if you're using coal at all, it's only to make jewelry, you wouldn't dream of burning it, it'll be so valuable. But that's kind of what we want, to drive fossil fuels out of the economy. And at the same time, taking the social justice point on board, we have to make sure that we compensate people who are now paying higher fuel bills. We would do that through our universal basic income scheme, but also through home insulation, through providing cheap public transport and so on. This proposal has been put forward in different forms throughout the conference, and I think it's something we need to all get behind and push very strongly next year, leading up to the COP. Obviously, there's also the question of the carbon border adjustment that will probably come up in questions. And I also think if we can turn this into a more global proposal, then the sorts of transfers that we'll be bringing about, which in our country might be fairly marginal, to some countries in the world where people have much lower incomes, would really transform their economic well-being. I wanted to say, I don't think anybody's mentioned wealth tax during these 2 afternoons. Maybe I just missed that, but to me, that's a very important proposal to make right now, not just because the billionaires are accruing more wealth, but also because we need to think about assets, not just incomes. We need, well, I'm sure other people on the Tax Justice Network have proposed a much more simplified and unified tax system. Our Chancellor actually recently proposed increasing the taxation on non-earned income to the same rate as earned income, which I actually support strongly, but we would go further as Greens. But that's an important proposal, that people who earn their money from having investments are not given these massive tax breaks. But I think also going beyond that to taking assets directly through a wealth tax, I think it's a very good time to propose that. And finally, I'm going to leap ahead a little bit now, and I'm really looking forward to what Harpreet is going to say. But one of the things that the British Greens are going to propose in terms of COP26 is connecting the idea of loss and damage because of the industrialized countries and all the carbon dioxide they've produced over the past 200 years that's destroyed our climate, with the question of reparations for slavery and the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. And I'm looking forward to hearing what she's going to say. But I think a proposal like that really links together the various campaigns about injustice, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's climate justice, whether it's the COVID injustice, can pull those all together and really be an exciting proposal, which I hope a lot of people here, and I'm hoping that the European Greens will be able to get behind that, especially if as global Greens, we can propose it from the side of the former colonizers who need to make reparations and the countries who need to receive those reparations. So that's all for now. Thank you.
Really interesting. 4 great points to go on with, and beautifully to time as well. So thank you. Sven, can I pass to you, please?
Yeah, well, I can't start before speaking about Molly, because I miss her much. The German Greens and the English and Welsh Greens, as I've learned, they have a lot in common. They are the largest Greens in Europe, so no other Green party is near our membership rate. And I'm in Germany more or less the only Green politician who has put a forest as a background Zoom picture. And without having met Molly since, I recognize she has had the same idea, which demonstrates how we worked over these 6 years together. And I really miss you. I only wonder whether your trees are truly indigenous, Molly. So I expected a 100% indigenous tree rate, which you probably...
I've gone for the deciduous trees and you've gone for the pines. Yeah. I'm not such a big fan of pines.
I was expecting 100% indigenous rate. Anyway, I stop kidding here. It's in particular because my humor is much more primitive than the one of Molly. Well, as I had already the possibility to express myself, it's the question where does the Green Deal stand is not so easy to answer, because it was an ambition. We had a roadmap, which is a communication, which about 60 different measures, but at its core is the so-called EU climate law. And the EU climate law will regulate the climate ambition and the governance of it. And once we have agreed on the climate reduction target, and then we will change the different sector laws in Europe in order to achieve that target. So therefore, the big battle was just today that the Council of the heads of state just said 55% to what compared to 1990 until 2030, at least. The Parliament said 60%, climate science says 65. So obviously Greens in the Parliament were pushing for 65, but at least we could get to the 60. And all this is not bad compared to 40, which is at the moment the EU commitment. What is of course truly painful is to hear Boris Johnson trying to show off with higher ambition than what we can get at the moment as average ambition in Europe. But one has of course to stress that the ambition of a country like Germany has to be in exactly the same magnitude as the one which is now proposed by Boris Johnson, because we have much poorer member states, much more depending on fossil fuels, and they will need obviously a bit more time in order to get their house in order. However, the Green Deal is on the way. And the key point why it is hard to judge is that only next year we will see the sectorial legislation. And the sectorial legislation will determine how much will be really done and how much will lobbies prevail. So, for instance, from a German perspective, how strictly will we be in order to reduce CO2 emissions of cars? And of course, the cars we are producing today have to be phased out. and they have to be phased out quickly. And obviously, this is the same question for all the several dozens of sector legislations. There are already some proposals out, and they are really promising. So Europe will use the common market for a green and climate-friendly product policy, which we didn't have so far. So there will be much clearer obligations when you want to sell products on the common market, that they have to have a longer life cycle. So, and all the stuff which is produced to be rubbish very quickly, as the colleague from Extinction Rebellion said, this will be phased out of the common market. And what is great about the common market, it is big enough to set a standard which will then be globally applied. We saw this with the data protection rules. Yesterday, the Commission proposed that's a sectorial legislation, the Batteries Directive. And the Batteries Directive they proposed is really stark because it will set human rights standards, sustainability standards, and recycling targets for the common market. And every battery which doesn't fulfill these targets, be it for a mobile phone, a laptop, or an electric vehicle, it cannot be sold anymore on the common market. And I'm sure this will change globally the supply chain for the critical areas like cobalt, lithium, and other things. And this shows the strength of the common market. And now you ask me in your lead question, of course, a bit of a funny question. What can we do to influence the European policies? And if I see the names of participants, looks pretty British to me. And you kicked yourself out. And therefore, your lever over European policies is very limited. And therefore, you lost basically the influence of the big power we have with setting rules on the common market. So do it. I'm really sad about it. I studied in the UK. I didn't learn proper English, as Molly always explained to me. But still, I know why you are Europeans. We are Europeans together. But how you will influence from Britain the European Green Deal, I would say relatively little, as you are non-members. But Britain can, of course, do one thing. You can do your own sustainability agenda. Nobody will stop you going further than the common market. This is what Boris Johnson tells wrongly all the time. The UK is free to have higher standards. Even now in the common market, in most areas of sustainability, nothing stops the member state to have higher targets, higher ambition. That's not a problem. So have high ambitions in the UK. It will not have the same global effect as if you were working with us, changing the ambition of Europe as a whole. I know Molly was siding with me on the same debate. But I have one last word to say, because there's so much grief in me about this departure. If you speak about the rules of European democracy, as some speakers spoke here on the panel before me, and say this is a neoliberal constitution, and forget that the real neoliberal constitution is a globalization without democracy, which will lead to a downward spiral for everyone. While in Europe, we have the possibility, even if it's under the constitution, not easy, to impose rules which then are binding a large enough common market to really green and make more social what we do. Then of course, you can see that for me, Europe is our best weapon against the embedded neoliberalism in global markets without global democracy. And this means that speaking about Europe like this is exactly the contribution the political left in Britain made to make Brexit and Boris Johnson possible. And stop this discourse it will destroy the possibility to build international democracy. Without international democracy, we have no chance to win. And therefore, speaking about the infant stages of international democracy, which you can see in European democracy, like some speakers spoke before me, you will destroy what British political scientists built after the war with many others. And I'm fed up with this discourse, and I have to tell you very openly, unpolitely, in a Teutonic way. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. I can say that some of us who live here are even more exposed to this discourse, and it's a very painful one. One of the many positive things about being part of a global movement is exactly the opportunity to have broader political discussions than sometimes happen in the UK. But of course, those of us in the UK have a responsibility to somehow to find a way out of these holes that we seem to have buried ourselves in, and back, as you say, towards a more globally democratic ethos. But without getting too miserable about Brexit, because we could spend a lot of time doing that, let me move to Harpreet and Leon. And we asked you to think about some of these questions from a different kind of angle, thinking about the responsibilities, indeed the debts of rich, polluting countries towards lower income countries that have typically made a much smaller contribution to global climate damage, and to think about what those responsibilities might be, but also what a way or possible ways of making them active might be, in order that we can find ways forward that are both climate just and economically just. So Harpreet, let me come to you first.
I think I'll actually start, and Harpreet will follow, if that's okay.
Sure. Yes, you've organised yourself without me. This is more efficient.
So yeah, we wanted to speak about the notion of climate justice, which is one that I hope is familiar to many of the audience and fellow panelists, and along the lines that you mentioned, Alex, in terms of what the historical responsibilities might be to those countries that have disproportionately contributed to climate breakdown and who have disproportionately benefited from the processes that actually led to the emergence of climate breakdown itself. So I just wanted to start by suggesting that to understand the climate crisis more fully, we have to pay attention to the histories of empire. So we have to understand how it was that the contemporary world has been made. I think too often responses to climate breakdown rest upon an ignorance about how imperialism and colonialism have led to a racist world in which some people's lives matter more. And as Molly kind of referenced previously, there's been a kind of uprise in protest and hopefully increased attention to these issues, but I'd argue that the ignorance is still quite pervasive. Go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I don't know how many of you encountered the work of Amitav Ghosh, but he wrote a great book a couple of years ago called The Great Derangement, and in it he suggests that we live in a world that's been profoundly shaped by empire and its disparities, that there are differentials of power between and within nations, and that these are greater today than they ever have been. In addition, those differentials are very closely related to carbon emissions, and I'll share some data which kind of illustrates that point in just a moment. And so fundamentally, we can't understand or respond to, or we can't hope to meaningfully understand or respond to the climate crisis unless we address this differential distribution of power in the world. Next one, thank you. And so I draw quite heavily in my own research and activism work on the work of theorists such as Gargi Bhattacharya, who's written on how it is that the contemporary capitalist system has a very racialized dimension. And again, I'll say a bit more about this in due course. But the key point, I guess, is that one of the features of colonialism, of colonial expansion, was that some human populations were essentially made irrelevant to the processes of economic development. So they were displaced from their lands. They were displaced both physically and symbolically, so their value systems were marginalized. Often they were only allowed, if they were allowed any existence, it was a kind of subhuman existence at the edge of those very same worlds which were built on expropriated land by the colonizers. And another theorist who I think has written about this and talked about this quite helpfully is Satnam Virdi, Professor Satnam Virdi from the University of Glasgow. And he identifies how ideas of racial difference, those same ideas of racial difference that have allowed members of the police to kill unarmed Black people in places all across the world. We've seen most recent kind of uprisings in France, or protests in France, the treatment of just one of a number of civilians at the hands of the police force there, but most notably probably in the US. And those same ideas of racial difference were kind of foundational to the making of the modern world. We couldn't have had the world that we have today without the kind of categorization of people into races and the structuring of world power and resources along the same lines. So ideas of racial difference, Satnam Virdi says, were used to justify the violence and genocide of colonial expansion. And so I think this map is quite striking here, is that we have a map of parts of the world which have at some point been under European control of one form or another, whether that's direct colonization or partial control. There are basically very few territories that were never in some way or another colonized essentially by Europe. And unsurprisingly perhaps, there's a stark correlation between those parts of the world that have been colonized by Europeans and those parts of the world which are disproportionately at risk to the harms of climate breakdown. So yeah, you would see in the previous map that there were, this is a kind of numbers of people who've been injured, left homeless, displaced, or required emergency assistance due to climate breakdown in a typical year. Thanks, Harpreet. And likewise, if we want to think about the economics of this, or the capacity of people to reproduce themselves, there's also a correlation here between the numbers of people who are living on less than $1.25 a day. The overlaps are quite stark. Thank you, Harpreet. Meanwhile, we could also chart life expectancy on a global map, and we don't need to do that. Our World in Data have done it for us. And again, the kind of coloration shows us that those parts of the world which were colonized by Europeans, on the whole, are experience significantly lower life expectancy. Meanwhile, those countries who have contributed the most to per capita emissions are those who are the same countries who either were European colonizers or were were settler colonies of white Europeans, so the US being an example, as well as Australia. And so I would suggest, again, just to reiterate the point, if we could have the next one, please, Harpreet, that we can't understand the climate crisis without knowing this history. And unfortunately, many people don't know this history. We know data from a few years ago suggested that many people were proud of the British Empire. The history of empire is not taught properly in schools, and it doesn't seem likely that it's going to be taught any more effectively given the kind of aforementioned ruling out of certain kinds of political teaching in schools by the current education secretary. But the problem here is that the countries who are most at risk from climate breakdown don't have the resources that they need to respond to climate breakdown, in part because although these places were incredibly wealthy, generated incredible profits for those colonizers, that money was generally siphoned off, used to fueled the Industrial Revolution here in the UK, in cities like Manchester and Birmingham, where I'm based, or siphoned off by local elites in the colonies. And so the resources are just not there. So I'll just hand over to you, Harpreet.
Thanks, Leon. So for what this looks like in terms of action from my perspective is first that the countries that were early industrializers, that emitted the most greenhouse gas emissions, do take the most effort to mitigate as fast as they can. Warren Wunt and Christian Aid earlier this year published a report which indicated that just to do the UK's fair share, taking into account its responsibility and its capacity to address the climate crisis, would mean very fast decarbonisation within the UK, but that wouldn't be enough to offset its responsibility for historic emissions. So it would require, the estimate was about £1 trillion of funding internationally to help countries around the world mitigate, decarbonise essentially through ecological restoration, as well as a just transition to wind, solar, hydropower, as well as finance the adaptation measures that increase people's resilience to respond. And adaptation can look like flood defences, rebuilding mangroves, but for me it's also about making sure that people have access to decent work, to safe and dignified housing, to be able to withstand the storms that have been made inevitable now as a result of historic emissions. And so looking at social protection as well as a form of resilience, adaptation resilience, as well as disaster risk recovery as well. And the final aspect of climate change policy, which was hugely contentious at COP25, and as Molly indicated is a particular area of interest for me, is loss and damage. And that recognises that for a lot of countries, they've reached their boundaries, the geophysical, social boundaries, to be able to respond. The seas are rising, the storms are more regular and stronger already in our world at about 1.2 degrees, and we can identify the hotspots that will just be inundated and require support to move to other territories and to be able to rebuild lives in response to devastating climate impacts. And that area is referred to broadly in climate change policy as loss and damage, and a lower ballpark estimate of the amount of loss and damage that we're expecting by 2030 every year is about $300 billion US. And so that's a kind of minimal scale. Just to give an indication, there's currently zero allocated to loss and damage financing within the UNFCCC. And even with the climate financing available for mitigation and adaptation, Oxfam has put the figure of public climate finance at about 12.5 billion, far short of the 100 billion that had been pledged over 10 years ago. The rest of it are non-grant loans, and so actually money-making schemes and not at all ways of repairing the historic responsibility and the capacity. And I just wanted to talk through some of the issues in relation to a few different countries, because I think it can be otherwise really abstract when we're talking about numbers. I think we can miss the human and lived experience. So this is a picture from Mozambique that was hit by two unprecedentedly strong storms last spring, devastating a city of Beira, which has a population a similar size to Manchester. And the government estimated that it suffered about $3.2 billion US in damage as a result. And of course, that number itself doesn't do justice to the fact that 2 million people were left in need, 1 million children needed humanitarian assistance. It doesn't count the number of women that had to give birth in temporary shelters with insufficient health and facilities, or the children that missed out on education opportunities. The stories of the children describing howling winds ripping buildings from around them, or the families that describe uncles, fathers going out fishing and not knowing if they would return. And what this looks like in a context of responsibility for those of us in the UK, I emit on average something like 20 times more carbon compared to the average person in Mozambique. If you're in the US, it's something like 50 times more. So when thinking about the impacts, and we know from research from the University of Oxford, these storms can be linked to anthropogenic climate change in the way that they're being made stronger and more regular. And so instead, what we're seeing as a kind of as a recovery, as a suggested recovery, and that we've seen over the years, both to storms like this and more recently to COVID, and suggestions from the World Bank, both for Mozambique and for countries like Senegal that are experiencing sea level rise and droughts, are instead a kind of, the World Bank suggests oil and gas is a part of the future of the country in Senegal's case, and in Mozambique we're seeing liquid natural gas funded by UK Department of Trade, an estimated, well, a huge figure that friends are litigiously, but the actual response is far from what we need. And of course, in a context in which a lot of these natural resources are being extracted and there are companies not paying tax, so that, and loans being given that preclude these countries from investing in the social protection that's necessary to be able to increase resilience. So with everything going in the opposite direction to where we need it to be going. This is a picture from Bangladesh, and ActionAid will be publishing a report, hopefully next Friday, International Migrants Day, on the impact of climate migration that is already being documented in 5 South Asian countries. And we're hearing documenting stories from people facing riverbank erosion, flooding, seawater rise, of displacements 4 or 5 times within people's lifetimes. They tend to move first to areas close to them. Those riverbanks are eroded, they move to other areas. And then eventually to places like Dhaka, where they're engaging either in very precarious informal work or in the garment sector where there's known human rights abuses. And this is an image from West Bengal, a quarry where there have been documented cases of people in the Sundarbans, which is exposed to cyclones and sea level rise, and documented stories of people leaving Cyclone Alia, which took place in 2009, and going to work in quarries and experiencing tuberculosis as a result, and often that being fatal. So the very opposite for that kind of approach. We will be seeing at COP26 strong calls for climate financing from developing countries, and Molly has suggested linking that with concepts of reparations, and I think that's a very key demand that a lot of movements from the Global South will be bringing. And Bangladesh is chairing the Climate Vulnerable Forum this year, and is very keen to hinge the success of COP26 on whether it can really address this question of financing for loss and damage that we're seeing, which is deeper because of the colonial and slavery history that Leon described earlier. Thanks.
Thanks, Harpreet and Leon. So we have some questions coming in, but I want to get in first and kind of direct a couple of things that have come out of that for me. So one is just a question about whether, you know, sometimes in monetary economics, there's always this thing about whether you have, when you have additional policy goals, if you need additional instruments, rather than trying to get away with hitting multiple goals with the same instrument. And so a question that occurs here is whether, in trying to deal with what are effectively imperial injustices, as our conference last week focused on, at the same time as climate injustices, if we do that with the same tool or set of tools, do we risk not doing either of them well? might it be better to separate them out? Or is this the one good chance we actually have to move things at the kind of scale that would make it feasible to have a profound impact on both? So Harpreet, can I ask that to you first, and then I might ask one or two of the, there's Molly with a hand up too. Okay, so I'll come to Molly next, but Harpreet, what was your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I tried to answer that in some of the case studies that I gave, that if we're not thinking about these things in very interrelated ways, we're not actually fixing either. Because if we're just focusing on the climate crisis and not thinking about the fact that people need stronger homes that can withstand storms, decent work in wind, solar, hydropower, ecological restoration, need to prioritize the form of the work that we need for a thriving economy that will enable us to transition in the way that we need to, then we're just not going to fix either. So I would answer the question by saying that trying to prioritize one will lead to neither being addressed.
Right, so my question is the wrong way around, in fact, rather than it being worth thinking about them being more effective separately. In fact, they can only be effective together. Well, that seems to suggest that something like the European Green Deal demands a level of ambition in the outside Europe bit that perhaps is not yet there. But Molly, was that where you were coming in?
No, not at all. I wanted to repeat very much what Harpreet said and just reinforce the fact that these crises are the same crisis. I think Leon also showed that very clearly. And so we need to address them both simultaneously. This is why this particular agenda is, I think, the most exciting thing with COP coming up. We need the carbon tax because we need that global tax price on carbon so that there's a key incentive in the market. But if we can work out a way to get the dividends distributed globally, we will start to address the historic injustices. But more importantly, if we don't organise something in the way of reparations, whether it's free technology transfer, whether it's actually free transfer for the adaptation measures, as Harpreet was arguing, if we don't do that, what we're going to see is just a replication of the same thing in a different form. But this time, the colonial exploitation will not be in terms of taking people's trees away. It will be in terms of organising climate finance so that those trees are absorbing our CO2 emissions rather than serving the people who they belong to. So to me, this is why it's really important that we connect these two issues, because otherwise our private finance companies and our banks will just reproduce colonial exploitation in another form.
So let me then put that to Sven and ask whether, in a sense, the ambition necessary is appreciated by, for example, European policymakers, and if it's realistic to think about delivering at the scale that's needed.
Well, my understanding from the really spot-on presentation of the two speakers was that this was not so much about the question, is the mitigation effort enough? So when it comes to the mitigation effort, it's obviously not yet enough, but there I think the convergence is already going in the right direction. We are not fast enough, and that's dangerous, but in order to rescue the global commons, which are the climate, we need to have a global effort. And for this, of course, what has been said, the moral case is totally clear. I think it's very hard to refute. So it's just a liberal question of pay your bill. So you cause loss and damages, so you have to pay for it. On the other, this is true. And obviously, in order to achieve the common good, we need the cooperation also of those countries which are at the moment in an asymmetric power position, because the main damage is in countries which are basically not in the strongest position, as was very clear on these maps. And on the other hand, those who have done the damage, for them it is relatively little attractive to pay reparations. And to me, the whole discussion reminds me very much of my own country and our more recent history. So if you see what happened first after Versailles and the First World War, where the responsibility question is a bit less clear, and even more so when you talk about the Second World War, where the responsibility is crystal clear. The moral case for loss and damage and reparations was even more clear than here with climate change. On climate change, one could say, well, the emissions until 1990, most people were not aware of the damage they did. Afterwards, of course, it's a different situation. We can haggle over the date, but in the end, the moral case is hard to refute. You have done damage for more than 30 years, consciously, at least of all the elites were conscious of what they did. But the moral case after Second World War was even starker. But the decision taken in order to make that somehow possible, was a different one. So the decision was not to ask Germany for very high reparations, although Germany paid some reparations, but really very small. In particular, Western Germany, it was said, look, we make you part of a community and we expect you morally to pay above average the bills of this community. And this has been done until today. So if you look at the share Germany is paying to all United Nations major programs, Germany is always paying far above their share. Also, the UK pays more than it should. And I think that is the way how it has to be designed for climate change as well. I'd politely disagree with my dear Molly. I think with the rhetoric of reparations, at least I don't know how to find majorities in Germany. I don't know whether you see majorities in the UK, which you bitterly need in your funny election system. So I don't know how you want to find the majorities. But another thing could fly, to say there's a common good. We have to finance it together. And we need all to pay into it, but we pay our shares according to responsibility and wealth. That is another thing, because then if you finance a common good, everybody who's financing it knows that they also have a benefit. In this case, development of new technology, innovation, and in particular, the protection of our planet. Then people are ready to pay above what is simply a quota. So in this way, we can have a reparation effect, but still a chance to win a majority. Morally, you convince me fully, no issue. But I don't think with this discourse alone, we can win majorities for the needed transfers. And for this, we need to define common goods and then find ways to finance that in a solidaristic way, such as Molly suggested, common taxes, common fight against tax evasion and the like, and then the pooling and sharing of these resources.
So I will ask Molly to come back on that, but I wanted to ask Leon first, because this is in a sense right in your area, if I understand it. You know, you put up that very nice line: to understand the climate crisis, we need to understand histories of empire. What worries me about that, and I think perhaps this is what Sven was driving at, is a sense that perhaps quite a lot of people don't understand either. And by combining two things that people may find, especially perhaps the legacies of empire, difficult to understand, while it's important that people understand them better, perhaps we risk short-term political action. So given that this is kind of an area that you've studied, I wonder what your sense is of how easy or how best we could make progress politically and bring people with us on that.
Yeah, I think it is a challenging question. I think something that Sven said kind of revealed to me, I guess, where I perhaps am, I don't know, least or less hopeful about the kind of established political decision-making structures. I think they are hamstrung, especially the electoral system in this country. I think we've seen that, how straightforward it is for it to be gamed. And I guess I'm more hopeful by kind of movements outside of parliamentary politics or forms of organizing, I guess at a more grassroots level, which involves some of that work of political education and discussing the complexities of this crisis with people on the ground, rather than it being kind of mediated through kind of policy platforms and programs. I mean, that's slightly to sidestep the issue, because it still means that you have to have a significant enough constituency outside of formal party politics to also be able to affect change. But I'm quite pessimistic in a way about the possibilities of winning electoral mandates on the basis of kind of within the current framework. But I do think that we might be overplaying the complexity a little bit. I think that it is possible for people to grasp these kind of two contrasting but related points. And I mean, my experience of talking to people about it, I guess on the whole, comes from speaking to students at the university, and some of them come with a very deep understanding of the issue, but most of them probably don't. And yet I would say that, you know, after an hour worth of workshop and a lecture and a few readings, everybody gets it, that, you know, it's not that beyond people's comprehension. I think the problem is that there's a question of values there, and we see still the legacy of colonialism in terms of how our structures of thought are shaped. And one of the kind of sort of most significant or most motivating value systems that kind of animates the contemporary world is one of racism and kind of racist structures of thought. And so I think we're going to have to confront those head on. You know, the addressing the climate crisis is also going to involve addressing racism, racist bias, nationalism, jingoism, and so on. I don't pretend that that's a straightforward thing to do, but I do think that it's entirely possible and within our reach. And I think it's more likely to happen through kind of organizing on a grassroots level than it would do within the confines of the formal political structure as it's currently organized.
I think this is sort of the kernel of something. It's that question about how do we get where we need to get, but at the same time not do things that sacrifice the longer term shifts that we need, but at the same time not allow the longer term shifts to become an obstacle to the immediate progress. But that kind of goes partly to the immediate question that that Sven had put to Molly, and I think Nick Shaxson in the Q&A has also raised. To what extent is there a discussion or an appetite in European, or well, in this case, Molly, in the UK, in policy circles for climate-related reparational justice, and in particular, he specifies involving the cross-border flow of money to lower-income countries?
I think it's a very new discussion, and the Green Party passed a reparations motion for the first time this autumn, and I don't think that would have been possible even in the Green Party without the Black Lives Matter mobilisation. And that shows you how you can shift opinion by radical demands and by street action, as well, as we've seen earlier with Extinction Rebellion. I always enjoyed arguing with Sven, and one of the reasons we were good colleagues was because we tested each other's ideas and we didn't agree. And I think this is an interesting comparison, the post-war German comparison, which is certainly worth thinking about. But obviously, the state of Germany at the end of the Second World War was utter devastation, and the concern of the Allies was not to reinforce that and the social problems that gave rise with between the wars. So I'm certainly going to go away and think about that, but I don't think the parallel is that precise. And of course, at the end of this campaign, we need a majority, but we don't necessarily need a majority for exactly what we're arguing with now. And what I see as the opportunity during the year ahead is to raise these really radical issues about global justice, about what climate justice really means, and also as a way of going onto the front foot to challenge racism and make a strong proposal. Because if you make this proposal about climate reparations, immediately people say, well, why should we do that? And then you get into that whole conversation about, you know, challenging the fact that Belgians are proud of their colonial history. I mean, this just blows me away. Brits as well, obviously. And the Dutch are the most proud of their colonial history. So, you know, it's a European problem. We've completely whitewashed our appalling exploitative past. And I mean, there are lots of things that can be achieved by this. Hopefully one of them is the transfer of cash, but along the way, you know, through making a proposal like this, the opportunities to really revisit our history. And it's probably because of Brexit that I feel this with particular strength, because Brexit would never have happened if we hadn't been lying to ourselves about what global Britain really means. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of things that come together in this proposal in terms of education and moving agendas forward. And ultimately, there will have to be transfers of cash and transfers of technology, but we might not get as far as getting a majority for exactly what we're talking about here. But I think we will make progress by having this conversation.
So I realised I missed Sven had wanted to ask Leon a question. So Sven, would you like to do that?
Yeah, well, to me, because I had a long history in social movements myself, and I know one certain pattern in discourses between movements and representatives in democracy and politicians. The usual thing is the following: if the movement doesn't get immediately a positive response because politicians say, well, what you are suggesting may not get us into the power position we need in order to realize it. So in the end, you do not get the popular support. Then the response on the movement side likely is, well, okay, there's a problem with representative democracy, so we do grassroots campaigning first. And by this way, I'm immunizing, in a certain way, the sphere of movement of the need to think about how to win majorities. I agree with Molly. In order to change the world, you don't need a majority. You need determined minorities. Usually that was enough. If they had a good case, they could also make a difference for winning over afterwards action by the majority. But however, you need, I think, movements like people in parliaments, in parties, need to think about what is the best way to achieve change. There's not a division of labor like movements are always right and politicians tend to be wrong, and the thinking over majorities is dirty. This is for the politicians, and we are the good guys and girls. We can afford to think out of the question what effect this has on majorities. My question is, Leon, from what I said, don't you think it is worth thinking how you can make your case in a way that it's more likely to win over larger parts of the population? I think it would be worthwhile. And I think first what Molly said on technology transfer, this is already part of the global climate agenda. This is already even anchored in the global climate framework and has to be strengthened. This is relatively easy to achieve. When it comes to monetary transfers, it's much more difficult to achieve a majority. And if you're right, saying only if these monetary transfers happen, if loss and damage happens, then some parts of the world will fully join in and be able to join in rescuing the climate. Then we have no time for 10 years of grassroots efforts, because in 10 years, we have to set the emission target globally on a downward trend. And therefore, my question to you is, how do you want to achieve majorities or near majorities in near future with this discourse of reparations? And what is the consequence for you of the scarcity of time, in particular out of the eyes of those suffering most for these deliberations? So I would like to break up this division of labor. I have to think about the dirty job and you are doing the clean job. Now I want you to put yourself into these shoes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have been kind of campaigning. I mean, maybe I overstated it in my presentation in my response to the initial question. But yeah, I mean, last year I was out on the streets around this time last year campaigning for what seemed like a reasonable step in the right direction politically, which would have been a Labour majority, or at least a Labour government, based on their Green New Deal, which had quite, I'd say, strongly socialist, or at least more than moderately social democratic foundations, and would have been a step in the right direction. And I think there was, if you look at the kind of polling around support for the policies associated with that program, there was quite widespread support. Of course, the problem with the formal party political system isn't necessarily the parties themselves, although, yeah, I think there's lots wrong with them as well. I think I'm talking more so about the wider media ecosystem, the kind of failure for politicians to get a fair hearing. And I'm not saying that we should necessarily, that it's not our job to think about that, but just that we also, I think, have to do the grassroots organizing outside of the formal political structures, especially when they are kind of set up in such a way as to sort of neuter more the kinds of radical proposals we need. And I would just go back to the point I think Harpreet and Molly were making, which is that you can't, so yes, we are too late in a sense. So we don't have those 10 years. And yet the only way in which we'll see a kind of acceptable, as far as I'm concerned, response to the already unfolding climate breakdown is exactly the transfer of resources from the north to the south. Those people are already facing the brunt of the breakdown. Yeah, I'll maybe leave it there. I don't know if my fellow panelists.
Thanks, Leon. I want to sort of just come in a bit on that, and then I'm going to ask Gominda Bambra's question to Harpreet, which sort of relates to another side of this. But when John Christensen, who's been present throughout this conference, when he set up the Tax Justice Network, he was well aware, I think, of very immediate needs, particularly in lower income countries and lower income groups in rich countries, of the immediate need for progress on tax justice, but at the same time recognized how far the public were from accepting the kind of narratives that they'd have needed to make the kind of changes that have since happened partly and continue to make progress on. And John's approach was to say, look, we can't just get one policy fix in and spend our time campaigning on that. We need to come up with the policy fixes, but we also need to change the weather. And that was his term, to embed with the wider public a different set of narratives. And we can't go for the immediate stuff at the expense of dropping that narrative changing, because otherwise we'll always be fighting the next bit of policy without a narrative behind us, getting away from the idea that it's smart to pay less tax, or that good businesses dodge tax to the benefit of their shareholders. That kind of thing was at least as important as getting an idea like country by country reporting for multinationals onto the agenda. And I suspect the board of which Sven was part was very much bought into that approach. So I wonder now if there is a risk, perhaps, that we say this is so urgent that we must make lots of, in a sense, bad political trade-offs and not actually put the effort in so much to changing the narratives around things like imperial legacies and reparations, which perhaps is where you were coming from, Leon. But okay, let me ask this question from Gominda to Harpreet rather than me talking. So Gominda Bambra asked the question, to what extent do these issues require us to address the issue of the overdevelopment, there's a contentious term, of the West? How do we persuade populations in the West to transform their or our ways of life so that we could all live well? In some ways, that might be an easier question than thinking about acceptance of reparations, but maybe it's harder because it requires individuals perhaps immediately to start thinking about their way of life rather than their governments to pay some money. So I wonder what your sense is of that, Harpreet.
Sure, and it relates directly to an article I just wrote last week for Navarra, so that's quite convenient. But just, I will answer the question, but just to go back to this, what's possible politically while keeping the larger narrative is absolutely essential, and it's the reason why NGOs continue to engage with issues on how loans are agreed, intervene in the Mercosur trade agreement to try and improve the sustainability, social standards in that. You know, Eurodad has made the claim that the European Green New Deal could consider debt to Green New Deal swaps for loans that are currently owed to the European Stability Mechanism and the European Financial Stability Mechanism could be transformed to give countries more fiscal space to, you know, do the domestic resilience work. So I think, you know, thinking about the interim policies without losing that bigger narrative is work that both movements and politicians have historically been able to do. And I don't think it, you know, it's a false dichotomy to suggest that, you know, I don't think anyone was suggesting that there was a distinction. I think we need to continue to do that work. Gurminder's question, thank you for that. And I think it goes to the heart of thinking about a transformative change, and also something that Molly opened with when she spoke. And for me, that's why do we have economies? And we hear a lot in response to COVID, we need to either choose between our health or the economy. But what is the purpose of the economy if it's not to protect our health and our well-being and the future sustainability of our planet? So I don't think this is a hugely challenging question to answer if we're able to say our lives will be improved. To use David Graeber's phrase, we will no longer have to do bullshit jobs. We will no longer be paying wealthy corporations to do, wealthy shareholders to do meaningless work that's actually not meaningless, that's actually actively harming people's lives and the planet's sustainability. So once we focus on what is required to live well, then there's some really interesting modeling done by Julia Steinberger and others that suggests that we do have the raw earth minerals and metals on this planet to give us what we need to all live a good life across the planet equitably. And I think it's selling, again, having that broader vision, that narrative that our lives would be better, all our lives would be better. We would have more time to spend with our families and friends and communities when that's possible again. And we wouldn't be worrying about the basic standards for living well, because the economy will be built to provide them and not to have the excess for a minority and lives of struggle for the majority.
Thanks. So we have some other questions coming in, and I'm being very bad at putting them to people, but I'm also intrigued about where this is going and the short-term, long-term piece. But let me come back to a point that Molly raised actually around wealth tax, because we haven't talked about that, and I wonder if it perhaps has the potential to draw some of these threads together. I think often there's been a resistance to wealth taxation because of the idea that it's the product of income on which tax has already been paid, and it's in some sense, you know, wealth is legitimate, and what business is of the state to intervene to take some of it. It feels like, you know, thinking about the Imperial Inequalities Conference we had last week and the discussions over these 2 days, you know, maybe we're in a bubble in the tax justice world, but I think we're also reflecting things that are going on. It feels like there is a potential shift in the weather around this point because of a growing awareness that so much of the distribution of wealth, particularly in countries like the UK, but more widely, stem from illegitimate processes, not only empire and slavery, but also centuries of, you know, a purely patriarchal wealth owning system, and a broader set of racial and other horizontal inequalities that all intersect to give us a very particular pattern of who the owners of most wealth are. So I wonder, perhaps starting with Molly and Sven for a sort of politician's take on that, whether you think there might be a way through, without perhaps winning every element of the hardest bits of the arguments immediately, to see wealth taxation, as it's moving quite quickly up the political agenda, as a way to raise the funds to do some of these very progressive and reparational things, without perhaps encountering the kind of opposition that there would have been 5 or 10 years ago or longer. Perhaps, Molly, if I can go to you first.
Yeah, well, I said at the beginning, I think the space for radical proposals is there, and we should shove all our radical proposals in as quickly as we can. And COVID has revealed the gross inequalities in our society. It's shown some people pushed into destitution while there's more billionaires, and the billionaires are accruing more cash. That's an argument that's easy to make. People can see Jeff Bezos or whoever, you know, profiting in a crisis. People hate that, and that's what they've done. And so I think, you know, I've seen some really surprisingly conservative people suggesting this in connection with COVID. And that's where it becomes a transitional demand, and you shove it in now and then it becomes like a normal thing, which incidentally it already is in lots of countries. It's also a very old idea. I know Jesus liked this idea, but I think you can go way further back into the Old Testament and all the sensible prophets of like 5,000 years ago who had this idea of Jubilee, because we know that once nothing accumulates money like money. So money tends to concentrate in a small number of hands, and along with it goes power. And then you end up with a society that's not only economically unjust, but also where some people are exploiting other people in perpetuity. So every now and then having a Jubilee and redistributing is an idea that, you know, was shared until we entered this particular form of capitalism. But also remember that it's the wealthy who are much more responsible for carbon emissions right now than the poor. They contribute far more because of their heavy energy lifestyles. So there's another reason why we would be kindly liberating them from their wealth and the sort of heavy energy consumption that goes along with that. But I have to say that I thought this would be an easy sell, but actually the Green Party, unfortunately at the moment, doesn't have this policy, although I'm working on that and I think we will pass it fairly soon. But when I proposed it to somebody who knows quite a lot about tax, he said to me, "What, you can't be talking about seizing other people's assets." I said, "Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about." But, you know, as you said, Alex, there is a level on which people are like, "That's mine and I'm keeping it in my trousers. Thank you very much." So, yeah, I think we need to make that case, but I think now is a good time to make that case.
Sven, I wonder if that tallies with your sense of things, you know, or if we're still kind of too far from being able to push this up a hill.
No, look, the German Greens actually are in favor of wealth taxation since a long period of time. So one of the rare things where we are more radical than the British Green. And I think they are very good liberal as well as communitarian as well as socialist and Molly or Christian arguments for this. So you can really justify it from very different grounds. And I think, as we know from tax theory, in order to get acceptance for taxation, it is even easier if you can say what it is good for. And I think financing the recovery in the green recovery after the Corona crisis is a very good reason why such a form of taxation is justified. And the economic splits, the social splits in our society, which are a danger to our democracies, is another one. I would only like to pour some wine into your water into your English wine, and that is if we want to see a fast transition of our economies, companies will need investment, and this doesn't fit very well together with any form of substance taxation. And therefore, I felt always, as a good post-Keynesian, I felt it was always a good idea to say, let us be really strong when it comes to making depreciation on the right form of investment. So if a company invests into green technology, they should get a really gracious depreciation on it, avoiding also your wealth tax and our wealth tax. But if you have passive capital, they should pay. So if capital is active and being invested in the green transition, then like this, such a wealth tax designed like this can help pushing up investment rates in the private sector, which we really bitterly need for the green transition. But those who only stack their money on some sort of more or less British offshore territory, they should pay. And by the way, the biggest reparation Britain could do to the world is closing down these tax havens. So I guess it's an easy point we can all agree upon.
Well, but as we discussed last week in the conference on that very topic, the UK has a major responsibility to help those jurisdictions develop alternative economic paths, not just say, you can't do any more this thing we've told you to do for decades. That's, you know, and that will have a high price tag. Now, I'm slightly over time, so I'm sorry about that, but I'm going to finish by asking Leon and then Harpreet, if I can, as select British citizens, what, if anything, you might ask the UK government to do in COP26, if you could get them to lead with one piece of policy that would set us on the right path, what would it look like? Leon?
I'll take, get the UK to sign up to its fair share. So forget about 2050, let's go for fair share and let's go for it immediately, so that we don't, as Sven pointed out, we don't waste the next 10 years that we already don't have in terms of locked in impacts.
Sold. Harpreet, you have the final word.
So if Leon's was a fair share for mitigation effort, then I'll say a fair share for everything else. So helping countries increase their resilience to the climate change impacts that we've already spoken about. And that means committing to new and additional public climate financing for loss and damage, which they're not going to do, but I would ask them to do it.
Don't give up hope. We can make it happen.
Yes, we must not censor our own advocacy before
Right.
they said no.
Well, and you know, the Climate Vulnerable Forum will come up with some proposals. I know that they were thinking of an international airline passenger levy before COVID, when that may still have been more lucrative than it may otherwise be. But so yes, there's still room to support those countries and movements that will be asking for strong contributions for countries that are already experiencing climate change impacts.
Well, look, on that, let me say thank you all, Harpreet, Leon, Molly and Sven. That's been a fascinating discussion. I apologise for the questions I didn't get to, and perhaps we'll send some of them on because I think they're interesting to continue discussing. But for now, let me hand over to Nick Shaxson, who is going to round things off for the day. Thank you all.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks, everybody. So this is the end of the session. I'm going to briefly round up. I think we've had a really fascinating 2 days and some really insightful contributions, and I have learned a lot. When the Tax Justice Network was set up in 2003, and shortly afterwards, we put forward some ideas which were called at the time pie in the sky, utopian, crazy, nobody's ever going to do this. I would cite corporate transparency, country by country reporting. I would cite automatic information exchange across borders of people's holdings of financial assets, transparency of the beneficial ownership of assets, unitary taxation with formula apportionment, all decried as crazy at the beginning. Now, all of these large, important, powerful policies are, to some degree or other, mainstream OECD, IMF, rich country policies. They are at the heart of the system. There's a long way to go still, but obviously things that seem utopian in one age, and it's never going to happen, things can change. This week, to cite an example that's somewhat outside the tax justice sphere, is the US. 47 US attorney generals filing suit against Facebook, against one of the biggest countries in the world. Really powerful suit as well, alleging all sorts of illegal activities. And this is something that would never have happened 5 years ago. And I've been watching these kinds of debates, they've been going on in the United States about monopoly power. And this is the result of organizing. This is the result of some really, really activist groups over there, not just looking at the technology sector, looking at monopolies all across the economy. And they have had an immense impact, really fast changing impact over just the last few years. And so this is the product of organizing. Something that was inconceivable just a few years ago is now happening. And now, of course, as many speakers have said, COVID has created a whole new, all the chips have been thrown up in the air, and there's a whole new era among us now. And this is the time for radical policies. This is the time where things that were inconceivable now can be put on the table and widely accepted. I think wealth tax is a really good example of that. My favorite, slightly trivial example of that is that one of our colleagues, Robert Palmer, got an article.
I am certainly tempted.
Sorry, I got a stray voice there. One of my colleagues, Robert Palmer, got an article in a British newspaper called City AM, which is actually a newspaper dedicated to supporting the City of London financial sector. And he got an article in saying we should have wealth taxes. That got quite a lot of play. You would never have got that even a couple of years ago. So there's quite a few big ideas come out of this. The idea that government borrowing, austerity, we need to balance our budgets. COVID has gone a long way towards killing that, because governments such as Germany's, which have been obsessed with balanced budgets, have realized they just have to create the money to support their citizens, and they have discovered they've been able to do it, and there hasn't been, as the scaremongers have threatened, massive surges in inflation, quite the opposite in fact. So new ideas are out there. And in the United States, as it was pointed out, the massive US government support during the Trump administration for people who lost their jobs is not that far away from universal basic income. I don't think there's a lot of discussion and dispute about universal basic income, whether it is a good idea or not. But one of the big themes that several people on this conference seem to have agreed on is that a very specific form of universal basic income, which is sometimes known as carbon dividends. Sven called it energy money, Energiegeld in German, I think is the correct term, where you raise the price of carbon, you receive revenues for doing that, whether it's through carbon taxes or auctioning permits or whatever, and then you distribute that equally among all the citizens on an equal basis, primarily for political reasons, because carbon taxes on their own are not going to be able to gain the political traction, and also they will be regressive economically, and they will harm the poorest people. And other ideas such as green financial transaction taxes, I think, are probably we're not pushing for things like this enough. So I think these radical ideas are now, we can now run with these things. And in terms of the last session and the sort of question of justice and reparations and racial justice, gender justice, other forms of injustice, geographical injustice, I would say that bringing all these things together and picking up on a point that Sven made about finding common goals, I would say that all of the issues that we have been looking at, whether it's tax injustice, finance injustice, monopoly power, climate injustice, all of these have very powerful racial, gender, geographical aspects which are harming essentially more vulnerable players in society. And all of the battles that we're fighting for tax justice, for anti-monopoly, finance justice, climate justice are all not explicitly, but implicitly will have powerful effects to improve justice in these other fundamental areas: racial justice, gender justice, geographical justice. And so we need to obviously keep pushing these ideas. We need to start supporting much more radical ideas than we thought possible in the past. And we need to join together. That's another very important message. We need to see how the different movements can work together and make sure that we are pushing in the same direction. So that's the end of the two-day event. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Thank you to all the panelists and speakers, and thanks to everybody in the audience. And wish you a happy 2021. Goodbye.